Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm really happy for today's episode, which I've been anticipating for a while, because today I'm talking to a friend of mine that I met back in 2019 at the Catholic Imagination Conference in Chicago, and I've been sort of meaning to have her on at an opportune time ever since. We've been talking on and off about various things over the past couple of years. She came on our other podcast, the Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, a while back, but this is the first time I've had an opportunity to talk with her about her work. So I'm really happy to have on the show Katy Carl, who is the editor-in-chief of Dappled Things, a Catholic journal of art and faith, and she's also the author of a wonderful new novel from Wise Blood Books, her debut novel, As Earth Without Water, which I'll just hold up to the camera here. I'm really excited to talk about it. I finished it at about 3:50 a.m. last night, and then I practiced piano and went to bed, as I do, and I loved it. It's really it put me through the ringer in a good way, and so I'm excited to talk about it. So I'll welcome to the show Katy Carl. Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, finally.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Well, okay, so I wanted to read a little line from towards the very end of this novel, which for me kind of was fundamental to what the novel was about. Who am I when what I am is stripped away like a garment and set aside? Can I be who I am? Can I do what I do without being destroyed by what I am, drowned in the ways I can be put to use? And that a lot of the book is about sort of leaving behind a false self, or the ways in which our true self becomes obstructed or suppressed or repressed, or often through our best qualities being used against us. And the book is about artists. It's about a spiritual journey, and that topic is, I mean, that dynamic is especially relevant in both of those matters. And so I really related to it both as a Catholic and as a musician, because I think that I've gone through some similar things. I think that this happens to a lot of artists. Well, perhaps I'm being too vague here, but part of the book is this this way that our dreams or our talents get undermined or sort of sidetracked, either sometimes by abandoning them altogether, or sometimes by the world of art itself and the vanity and the sort of like superficial or irrelevant aspects that often get tacked onto art and end up smothering it. So I really appreciated this book on those levels and many others. So it felt very relevant to me personally.
I'm really glad. And I think, the struggle to see ourselves accurately, see ourselves clearly, this question of identity is really central to a lot of what's going on in the postmodern world, and particularly in creative circles, which we both inhabit, right? So I'm really glad to hear that it resonated. And, the dynamics that are at play there, obviously have some relationship to my own experience, but these two characters also are both very different people from me. So it's really wonderful to hear that it resonated with you, and I hope it will with lots of other readers as well.
So can you just give people a brief introduction to the scenario of this novel?
Sure. The novel is based around Angela Solomon and Dylan Fielding, who are two visual artists who started out together studying first in Chicago, then in Italy. They moved to New York together to try to break into the art scene there. Dylan succeeded at that. Angela did not, and took a job doing graphic design instead in Chicago. And when the novel opens, all of that takes place before that main action of the novel. So when the novel opens, they're meeting again for the first time in years in a gallery in Chicago. and they're looking together at a portrait of her that he's made, and this sparks a reflection on what their past together has been, what their relationship has been like, and then that further unfolds through 5 years after Dylan's entrance into a monastery, where he more deeply is reflecting on his own spiritual experience, and particularly on trauma that he's suffered since he converted. And she's helping him work through and decide what to do next. So that's the main scenario. These two, the sort of ongoing conversation that unfolds throughout the novel between the two of them, or what the relationship between them has meant in both of their lives, and what it will mean in the future.
And Angela is the narrator of the novel.
Correct. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So we see through things through her perspective. And that moment you mentioned early in the book when they're looking at this portrait was the moment that I got really like hooked into the book, when she is responding interiorly to seeing of her that he had painted years ago in Florence, and and she says, "And there I stood, confronted with what I was, and the what erased the who, or obscured it beyond hope of recovery, which added up to the same." And then later on, its coyness, its pretended disclosure of secret things, revealed the mindless object I both feared I was and knew I was not, the unremovable disguise that was also my own skin. And that was a fascinating experience to go into, as somebody who's never had that experience, obviously, where it's great because it both plays into this spiritual problem and this artistic problem at the same time, where and this problem of the relationship that she has with Dylan, where he's painted this nude of her, which she never liked, and he had promised not to show. She had made him promise not to ever display it, and he ends up doing so at the Art Institute in Chicago, and in this way that it almost like I don't know how to describe it exactly, but first of all, I mean, there's the obvious aspect of like what you might call like objectification or whatever, the sorts of some of the things he's talking about there. But then as an artist, it has this influence on her as well, because she's now put into this position of being the muse, and he kind of makes this move to put her in that position such that she is put at a distance from her own identity as an artist. And that's something that is sort of rolled out over the course of the novel and really confronted by him at the end, a really beautiful passage where he apologizes for this finally. But it's fascinating, it's a whole experience, the experience of being a model, and then being an artist, and the difference between those two things, and whether those two things can coexist, especially in the context of a romantic relationship, that it almost becomes this way of exercising power, was really fascinating.
Right. Right. And art history is sort of rife with examples, right, of this kind of dynamic between, not necessarily even two different painters, but sort of the woman who supports the artist and is the muse and does, all the background work so that he can achieve and he can, he can excel, he can shine. And more contemporary art history, there are specific examples of artists or writers, right, where this dynamic is obtained, right. So that kind of story interested me. I think just the question of what it means to try to depict a human person in a way that's respectful of their experience when that experience is very different from yours, which again is something that I wrestled with all throughout the writing of this particular book. The distance between these experiences and my own proved fruitful because it forced me outside of myself, which is, I think, the one of the gifts of creativity, that it causes you to try to step outside yourself and see as someone else might, but then it involves you in all kinds of responsibilities to do justice to others' experience, to others' subjectivity, right? And to try to, to put it very bluntly, try not to depict them in a way that they would hate to be depicted. To try to see simultaneously the truth that you see and the way that it would appear to somebody else, if that makes sense. And you're also always, as a writer of fiction, particularly doing that, trying to sit both in your own seat and in the readers at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, and to understand how something sounds to somebody who's not inside your head and who is picking it up for the first time, and to understand what their experience of the text will be, and to try to shape it so that it can have that experience for the first time and sort of walk with you and see what you would like them to see. And of course, this is right, really central to the experience of writing. And I imagine to music too, you have to think about things like what it sounds like out there in the
Mm-hmm.
audience, the acoustics, and the pacing and the timing, things that will affect the experience of the person receiving it.
Well, it's interesting to kind of compare these two characters because Dylan is the one who's sort of more recognized by others as being like sort of like this blazing talent and also having this sort of personal charisma and beauty as well that attracts people to him and helps him to become a success. And Angeli, it's made clear throughout the novel, Angela, I should say, is it's made clear throughout the novel that she is equally gifted as a painter. But there's also sort of a difference in their the way that they regard themselves and the way they regard others. Where Dylan is very needy. He's very he really needs to be affirmed and validated by others at all times. But he's unable to have like lasting relationships with people because he basically just uses them when he needs validation in one form or another. And he also allows himself to be used by them to get what he wants in his career. And Angela, she also, I mean, she also allows herself to be used, obviously, but she seems to be a little bit more able to see who he is. And also, even though it's not that she knows her true self exactly, but she does on some level. It's not that she's like embraced it, but she kind of she has a little bit more of a certain self-awareness or self-consciousness that he lacks for much of the novel. And so, what do you think it is that allows her to see who he is and to be sort of at a certain point to be clear about, you know, the way that he relates to people in a way that it takes him longer to realize?
I think that's a really good question. I started writing this many years ago with a theory in my head, or I guess a hypothesis, that because she is the one who is bringing more authentic love to the interaction, to the relationship, that she has clearer vision as well. And I think that that's true up to a point, but I think the novel explores the limits or the extent to which that's true of her, and the things that she can't see regardless of her affection. And just correlated with that, the extent to which her love is actually, to some extent, self-regarding or self-enclosed as well, right? And that she doesn't completely or fully or truly see who he is, because she, right, lacks a vision of the spiritual dimension, and she comes to realize that over time. I think,
Well, another
yeah.
aspect of the book is this the way that their artistic life develops over decades, because we get all of these different snapshots of, you know, 2010, 2015, and then going back to their student days in like the mid 2000s. And there is this innocence and this sort of like amateurism in a good sense, this love of the art that has yet to be sort of like undermined by the professional art world. And I think that a lot of artists can relate to this idea of like losing their initial innocence. Sometimes that comes through studying the craft and losing sight of the childlikeness of it all. But other times that comes through the commercial pressures, the vanity of it all, the need to follow fashions, or even if not to change one's own art, the personal compromises that need to be made to make one's way in the world. And I think that this addresses all of those things. But I'm curious if that where that whole discussion, that whole exploration in the book comes from. Is that some part of your experience? Was there sort of like a period of time where you had to go through this this re-embracing, or this returning to sort of an original artistic impulse where you had trouble getting back to it for a while?
Sure. Just to take the broader view first, and then kind of zoom into the personal. I think most folks who try to do any kind of creative endeavor, and particularly in America today, also having to try to balance this with making a living, making a life, which are two different things. Find that there's, most of us are not going to make our living doing the creative thing. It's almost always going to be something that we have to fold in with other endeavors. And I think, yeah, there are a lot of economic pressures, social pressures, cultural pressures that come to bear and sort of drive people off their initial path or their initial intention. And of course, they're both dealing with this in different ways. Certainly, in my own life, I found that I always wanted to write fiction, always being really, from really far back. But I knew from early on too that was not likely to be, the way that I paid the bills, or the way that I spent most of my time, right? Because I knew that I also wanted a family. So, there's just a gradual process, I think, over time of, realizing that I was not going to go, to New York. I was not going to, to try to break into the mainstream publishing establishment, and that I was going to be, doing this in sort of a sidelong or unconventional way. And then you're realizing that if I were going to do it, if it were going to be worth the time I was going to put into it, that it would have to be, I would have to take it slow, and I would have to be focused about the time that I did have, because it was going to be limited, and I needed to try to make it worth the time that I put into it, if that makes sense. Not worth it in terms of any sort of return on investment, right? In an external sense, but to be attentive to reality in a way that would, I guess, be beneficial to myself and in my own spiritual and intellectual life, and hopefully would bear fruit that would be beneficial for others as well. And I think that can be really hard to maintain, over time, for sure. And that's by no means a closed story, or one that's over.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's this part near the end of the book where Angela is talking to her aunt. She's kind of dropped out of the art world and then has been doing like, there's this part earlier in the book where somebody refers to it as, oh, you've become a creative now, which is like this this word for, I totally got what that meant. It's like there's like being a functionary, essentially, who thinks you're an artist, and some people fall into that. But there's she ends up dropping out of that too. She loses her job, and she she says something along the lines of, if I'm going to do this, I need to, in a sense, like take it less seriously. And I really related to that as well, because I think that, and this relates to the line that I quoted at the beginning about, like, can you serve your function without being drowned by it? My experience was that I basically didn't have the wherewithal to pursue a craft without really being fully focused on who I am as an artist, if that makes sense. This is something that I'm working through right now. I mean, but I basically, you go to, you start out, you go to music school, you learn the craft, you learn that there are all these things. I have to know this, I have to know this. If I want to make it in this world, here's all these things that I have to practice. And you know that they're going to benefit you artistically too. But what I found is that, especially after coming to New York and sort of facing the scene, I quickly became intimidated and overwhelmed and not able to sustain my efforts in partially because I had gotten sidetracked by, I think partially by my music school education, into focusing too much on all of these things that you have to do. Like, you have to pay your dues in all of these ways, where I want to study all of those things, but it's like, it would have been better if I had been focusing on, not in terms of like, these are required curricula, so to speak, but like, this is, if I had done it in the reverse fashion, where like I started with like, okay, what do I like? What gets me inspired? What gets me excited? And then I find my way into those other things through that. Does that make sense? So
It
that's
totally
something
does.
that I'm trying to recover right now, because I basically squandered my 20s not doing what I had really wanted to do artistically. And some people have the ability to go there and to pursue a music career as a professional, whether or not they have that. But I just found that I couldn't find the motivation to, I don't have the inner resources to do things without the love being first and foremost, because otherwise I can't be motivated. And that's true on many levels,
Sure.
but including music. So like, I just can't get out of bed in the morning without a higher reason. It's like, I conceive of it as being weak. I'm sure that there's more to it than that. I conceive of it as like, well, I need God more because I'm weaker than other people. But I'm sure there's all sorts of, it's a gift in a way, but I mean, I'm kind of rambling here, but that is to say, I understood what she meant when she said, take it less seriously, because what I sort of feel like I'm coming to now is, I just have to like let go of like, okay, it doesn't matter if anybody even knows that I am a musician. It doesn't matter if anybody hears what I do. Like it all of that is too much pressure, because some people have the simultaneous like genius and vanity to like pursue all of those things at once. Whereas I just get intimidated by any of that, if I'm allowing anybody in the room with me psychologically, if that makes sense, like when I'm practicing or whatever, I just can't motivate myself to do it. I can't face the piano keyboard. And so I'm getting to that point where I'm like, okay, I just have to be doing this and not worry about the practical aspects of it, not worry about like particular skill set that I need professionally, and not worry about like what's the production point, what's the point at which this produces a work that other people can see, so that I can prove to the world that I am an artist, you know. And so this is really just a process I'm at the beginning of right now, but the book was timely for me in that way, I guess.
Yeah, I'm really glad, and I really do think that a lot of creatives in our culture suffer from this exact dynamic that you're describing. Which one aspect of it, right, is the business side of art, which is always kind of, I don't know, for a non-business minded person such as myself, I find having to think about all the practicalities, like it's kind of discouraging. And I've been really fortunate in my publisher, Wisewood Books. They've been very, very good about keeping keeping the painful side of that to a
Right.
minimum. And I think that's one of the gifts of working with a small press is that yes, you have more promotion work to do on your side, but also sort of more of what makes the process a joy, right? The conversations and the interactions that, from stories that I've heard from other folks working with a bigger publisher, you often just sort of feel like a cog in their machine rather than, an active participant in what happens to your book after you're finished with it, right? And it's been a gift to be kind of an active participant in the production side, which does interest me as someone who's worked on various sides of the editorial desk. I find that weirdly fun in a way that maybe not many people would. But right, so that can be a discouragement, right? The sort of machinery, to a certain degree, I totally get that. And then too, this whole myth of the art monster, which Dylan definitely is an art monster, and Angela wishes she could be. But I think that really limits who gets to consider themselves an artist and who gets to, right, have that sort of privilege or that sort of identity for themselves, who gets to claim it, right? This picture of someone whose sole pursuit, right, is the creative life, and who we don't see as having much of a life outside of that. I think, yeah, it can create situations where folks have breathtaking technical excellence, but there's sort of an emptiness at the heart of what they do. And I don't know if you've experienced that, but I can think of maybe, I don't know if I want to name names, but, art novels or stories that I've read that I've thought, that's dazzling, but what does it all amount to? It's the problem of what Helen DeWitt in The Last Samurai calls the stupid virtuoso. and, the person whose technical excellence doesn't seem to serve anything beyond itself. And I really guess I do have sort of a fear of doing well in a way that doesn't do good, if that makes sense.
Right. But there are also people who create work of genuine depth at the expense of
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
everything else in their life.
For sure. And that's what makes it tempting, right?
Right.
The thought that you could, right, create a work of genius if only you sacrifice literally everything else about yourself or in
Yeah.
your life. Any other claim on human happiness, right?
Right.
Right. It's I won't lie and say it's not tempting. It is,
Right.
right? But I also don't think that that's a recipe for human flourishing necessarily.
Yeah. This book deals with also with the religious conversion of Dylan, who becomes Brother Thomas Augustine in a monastery in Kentucky. And I don't think it's ever explained how he got to that point. There's conversion that happens in the monastery that we are able to get some insight into, but it's never. Am I remembering correctly? It's never really explained the process by which he became Catholic and became a monk.
It's very outlined, the process. He has the priest who becomes an important figure in the middle of the novel, who is never named in the novel, and that's on purpose. He sort of works, just the appearance of him works as a sort of sign on Dylan when he's already kind of leaning in the direction of, he's reading Thomas Merton, but he's not letting anyone know,
Right,
right, that
right.
he's inclined to do this. And then he sort of runs off and does it without telling anyone, without explaining to anyone. And I ended up locating that in the character because I wrote, part of it was technical. I wrote scene after scene after scene where he was explaining and self-justifying, and trying to bring other characters into the mystery of what happened to him, and none of them seemed alive. And in the end, I decided the better choice was just to present the action
I see.
and to let that be interpretable how the reader would. So I guess that's why that shook out the way that it did. You know, I think you're right. There's more attention given to sort of the ongoing conversion that's still happening while he's there, and even after he's experienced this trauma. He's trying to understand what that means for his spiritual life and trying to find a way of moving forward, right? Regardless, or not regardless, but taking into account that something terrible happened to him, and still trying to find a way to trust God, right?
Right.
Which is a lot of the second half of the book.
Well, the book deals with priestly abuse, and I'm just want to ask how you prepared to approach that in the novel, because there's one particularly wrenching scene where the whole psychology of how he's responding to this thing that happened to him is really laid out in like granular detail. So I'm curious what kind of preparation you did for that, how much of it was imaginative and how much of it was like reading accounts and people's, stories of themselves and things like that.
Sure. I mean, I did read, I read parts of the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report. I read parts of books about, this phenomenon by various folks. I read works by psychologists, particularly The Body Keeps the Score, which is sort of a very, it's very much in circulation right now. The ideas in that book, there was an article in First Things about it not too long ago. And there's, of course, there are always going to be some critiques, right? But I found it very useful in describing the psychology of what happens to somebody after they've been abused, after they've been radically betrayed, right? They will sometimes, as Thomas Guston does, blame themselves, wonder what they did to cause it, and of course, when the answer is they didn't do anything to cause it, it just right, it's the mystery of evil in a human character that somebody could do these things, right? But I didn't want it to too closely resemble any specific story that would be in the news, for example, or in the in the Grand Jury Report. I felt that it needed to be its own its own story, right?
Right.
Not something that was going to be a copycat or ripped from the headlines kind of dynamic. So that's why I framed it the way that I did. And that's kind of how I prepared. I did do a good bit of reading and research. It wasn't purely imaginative in that sense.
There's an author's note at the back of the book.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it wasn't purely imaginative in that sense, although in terms of the events, it just the outline and the structure of the events, is purely imaginative.
Right. So there's an author's note in the back of the book where you explain that, but you also say you invoke Solzhenitsyn, saying the line of good between good and evil runs through the human heart. And so I took that to mean that even though this character is a victim, you, for the sake of fictional truth, you are not portraying it as there's more nuance to it. Not again, as you say, not that he invited this or anything like that, but that it does have a relationship to, not a causal one, but it has a relationship to things that he's done or experienced earlier in life. And that's what I found, one thing that I found interesting about it is that, if you were doing a story about a child who experienced abuse, that's the closest thing to being like a pure victim, right? Mm-hmm. Outside of Christ. Mm-hmm. And Dylan, on the other hand, is someone who has been sexually profligate in his past with both men and women. Mm-hmm. And he also comes to this realization that he has used others, he has abused others, in particularly in apologizing to Angela with about the portrait that he did and the way that he handled that whole thing, where he likens himself to this priest who attacked him, and she, of course, says, no, that's you're nothing like that. But and I don't want to like make a judgment on his comparison, because I think it's more useful to just allow that to stand as a way to provoke thought. But it was interesting to me how you handled the resonances between this thing that happened to him and things earlier in his life. And I thought that it was done in a very nuanced and not overly facile way, where you allow these things to stand and these resonances to stand without sort of trying to give an easy answer or to dismiss, any number of things that Dylan could genuinely learn from this experience. Like you allow him the opportunity to learn from this as well as a person, as a sinner in need of conversion. And I thought that was really good.
I think part of the mystery of, right, part of the mystery of evil in human character is also, the mystery of how God brings good out of, even out of really heinous human evil. Which I'm not for a second saying that this is, what happened to him is definitely a, I would never want to say that it wasn't a heinous evil, but I'm glad that you picked up on it, and I'm grateful to have you articulate, that it does cause him to reflect on ways that he himself has caused harm. I think he goes too far, and the self-blame that he falls into is excessive. And I think, I try to allow other characters and maybe the circumstances of the story also to provide a corrective for that, but to also honor the truth of the character, in that he is having this interior experience. It is very intense for him, and that it does lead him to sort of to a sort of repentance, to reflect on on his own past. I wonder too. I think he was more susceptible, right? Although he wants to believe that he wasn't more susceptible to to being abused, because right. Because some of the things that happened when he was younger, he was underage, right? It's another act of abuse occurred, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So, he maybe was more at risk to begin with, and
Yeah. This does seem to be something that abusers like somehow are able to sniff out. I've never quite understood why. There's some psychology to it where people, because you hear these stories like, oh, I was abused multiple times by different people in life. And I'm like, how is that possible? That happens to the same person. But it seems like that there's some kind of vulnerability that is sensed by people who are looking for prey.
Sure. And some of the reading that I did tended to indicate that, it is this internalization that happens, right? That someone starts to think, well, that's, that's sort of normal, or that, is something that I should expect from others, right? I can't expect to be treated better than that, where, of course, you should. No one should expect this, right? But over the course of the writing, I hope one thing that has come through is that I really came to love the character of Dylan, and really want the best for him.
Yeah.
And I've been asked if I would consider writing about these characters again, because there are things that are left unresolved, even in the conclusion. And I think so. They're definitely things to continue, right, developing, right, ways that they'll both continue to grow, even after the conclusion.
Yeah. Spoiler alert to people listening, so skip forward a couple minutes. But I just want to say, I appreciated the fact that you didn't have them get together in the end. My instinct is, I guess this is pretty normal, but my instinct is very much the romantic one, and I want people to get together in stories. And so I first had to like, you know, but I think that it makes total sense because as a matter of like personal maturity and spiritual development, it's like, yeah, that shouldn't have happened. You know, she was right. She wasn't ready, you know? And so if you're just looking at it with soberly, that was the right choice for her. And so, that doesn't mean that the situation that we find ourselves at the very end is the definitive one, but it is, you know, the novel is about these two people who ultimately, in a sense, end up finding their way on their own, you know, but with influence on each other. And so there was this sense of like, yeah, ultimately it is us and God. And that's the story. And that's where everything has to be dealt with. And so there was like a realism to that I liked as well, a spiritual realism.
And thank you for saying that, for observing that. Yeah, I do think, I think as a writer, it's important to let your characters make mistakes sometimes, not always have them have to be right. But I do think you're right. She was correct about that. That there can be situations, of course, where a relationship is part of people's healing. That happens all the time. There are also situations where you shouldn't get into a relationship if you're not healed enough, if you're not at a place. And I do think at the end of the novel, sorry, skip ahead again if you're still, still don't want spoilers. I do think at the end of the novel, neither of them is really in a place yet where that could be beneficial for them, where they could be part of each other's healing.
Right.
And yeah, you observe, and I think you're quite right that in the end, it is us and God. Even if you are in a relationship where healing is taking place, and you're part of that for each other, it's all still ultimately grace.
And in a sense, I think that this like ability to be alone with God is something that Dylan does need to be able to learn to be alone with God is something that Dylan needs to confront. And at first he tries in a way to confront it in the monastery, but he's still looking for, that community. He's looking for support from others. And, for mysterious reasons, that doesn't work out. And I don't know that I could say what, after just having read the novel, what's the providential reason that God brings him to this place, partially inspired by running into this guy who later abuses him. And then he goes there and gets abused and then leaves. And it's like, well, what was the point of that? But there are indications that actually does lead to growth. And so he's going back to New York in this place where he feels like he's not going to last very long in his faith, without somebody else to support him. But maybe that's something that he has to learn, is to be not so needy, not so in need of validation from others. And so, and then, in Angela's case, she's sort of giving herself up to find herself. So it ends up being providential that she dropped out of the art world, that she didn't even keep her creative job, because it enables her to start rediscovering her art and then to have this spiritual awakening as well.
I think that's well said. I think that's a good reading. And there's, I think that's a good reading. And to sort of expand or elaborate on the questions that you were raising earlier about the artist's identity and how we see ourselves and how that affects how we're able to create, right? I think it's not until she lets go of the need to prove something, the need to be seen in a certain way, that she's able to really find the core of what she's trying to do, and to just do it regardless of what other people think of it. And then, it's not until then, paradoxically, that the work begins to gain the kind of attention that she would have liked to have in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really interesting how, I was talking about people who can who can be artists and simultaneously chase the world's approval and make good art at the same time, and then the people who just don't have the wherewithal to do that. And I think ultimately the chasing of the world's approval, it does kill art in the long run every time. But some people are able to sort of maintain this compartmentalization on some level for a while. And I think that, Angela represents the people like me who just like they just can't handle it, and they just drop out, and have to rediscover it in a more pure way. And in some way that is a privilege, that is a grace from God, because I think that it saves you from the fate of the artist who makes great work, never figures out who they really are, or burns out very quickly and crashes and burns in personal, pathologies. And so I think that there's two sort of like archetypes of artistic paths here that I've observed both, and I feel more in the Angela camp. But I totally understand the people being jealous of the Dylan, type people, like you were saying.
Sure. Yeah, and I think key for her is learning to tell a different story about who she is and what
Right.
she's about. Um,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the novel really, really moved me. And I kind of feel like I have to read it again, and I hope I will soon. But yeah, it's really wonderful. I do highly recommend that people pick it up and read it, because it's very beautiful.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that.
Well, let me ask about this, because this novel was produced partially in the context of your being the first writer in residence with Wise Blood Books, who published. And so how did that all work? I mean, you were working with the editor Joshua Wren on this, right?
That's right. Your friend and mine. Yeah, and that was an extraordinary experience. I am incredibly grateful to the donors who made the Wise Blood residency possible. And another, by the way, while I'm thinking about it, it would be awesome to chat sometime with the other writer in residence from 2021, Sally Thomas, whose works of mercy is due out from Wise Blood next year. As we know, Dr. Wren is an incredible editor, incredible fiction writer himself, and so to have the benefit of those eyes on this manuscript, he was able to see what I wanted to do and to help me do it better, which you can't ask anything better from an editor. So, I'm just incredibly grateful. And, that experience too, in a funny kind of way, it was an experience of learning to tell a different story about the creative life and what's possible. I completed the manuscript during 2020, during the, sort of the peak of restrictions from the pandemic, travel restrictions. And, this was pre-vaccine, so people were very, very worried. There was a lot of community spread. A lot of people were really suffering. And, I decided in that context, there was, it wasn't prudent for me with four small children to go travel, to another part of the country to do the residency in person as we had originally planned. So it happened over Zoom, almost all of it. And we set aside 2 weeks, one in the summer and one over Christmas break. And we just went through the manuscript sort of chapter by chapter, chunk by chunk. And line by line edits, and talked over sort of the big and small picture. And it really dug down into the technical weeds of every aspect, from image to metaphor to the shaping of the entire arc of a story. And it was transformative, and not just in the sense that it helped me craft a much better piece than I would have been able to do, working alone. And I think there's a lesson there about artistic community, and that again, the myth of the solo art monster versus what almost every successful artist is, I think, which is someone who works in community. Whether that's acknowledged or whether it remains in the background. But also, right, at this time when, right, sort of this narrative of disaster and decline, and the worst case scenario was in the ascendant. By buckling down and just focusing on what we could do and not letting go of what we couldn't, and there was the capacity to create something new, which again, hopefully, I think I hope that it will reach its readers and do the work that it's intended to do.
You are, of course, an editor yourself. You're the editor in chief of
Yeah.
Dappled Things, as I mentioned before. And I'm curious how you ended up getting involved. Did you start out as a contributor before you became staff at the journal?
So I did have actually a couple of poems, although I'm not really a poet. I had a couple of poems in the first issue,
Wow.
the very first online issue of Dappled Things, which, again, sort of a
What
reversal
year was that?
narrative at the time in
Okay, 2005.
2005 when every other. So Dappled Things got started in 2005. So the very first issue appeared online in Advent of 2005. But at the time that every other lit mag on the planet was going completely digital, going online, dropping the print because of the high production costs and what have you. Dappled Things was very ambitious to get into print. It was in 2007 that we printed our first, paper issue, and I joined not long after that. I became editor in chief from having been an associate editor earlier, joining earlier that year, and then you know I always think of it as another example of how rather than doing what the market trends tell you should be doing, should you know, look at what's possible, what's actually possible, as opposed to what you're being told is possible. Um, and we found that not only could we move into print, and through the generosity of donors and our readers and subscribers, keep ourselves in print year after year, but also continue in print much longer. I think 5 years is sort of the average life of the small literary magazine, and we've been going now for 17.
Wow.
So, I'm really grateful to have been a part of it for so long, and you know, I I think that it occupies a place in the literary ecosystem that needs occupying. I think it's worth looking specifically at the contribution that the Catholic imagination can make to American letters, and to global literature and overall. Right, where there are magazines that focus on the contribution of writers of faith in general. I think that's important work too, and I'm very grateful to the folks who do have done and continue to do it. But having my faith be so much a part of my identity, and having spent so much time thinking about what that means specifically as a creative, I'm glad that a community exists, right? That can sort of fold all of those things together and be sort of a hub for people who are thinking these questions through themselves, and particularly in terms of the contribution that Catholicism makes.
So, since you've been the editor in chief there for so long, what's your sense of how things have changed in the past, whatever, decade and a half? And like, do you feel like the level has gone up over that time, or anything like that?
So I think that several things have happened. So I think as as we've become more better known, I think we are garnering a higher level of craft and of submissions than we were at the beginning. I just also think that there's and there are a lot of reasons for this, which we could get into, but I think there is also just a greater degree of openness in the literary world to narratives of faith, and narratives of belief, and to taking belief seriously. Whereas I think when I was coming up straight out of undergraduate in 2005, 2006, there was a sense that, your faith is something that you check at the door when you come into an MFA program, or when you sit down to write a serious work of literature. That there's sort of these unknowable questions, and we sort of leave these aside and we focus. Realism, right, means focusing on what we can see, taste, touch, smell, and hear. And if you get very much beyond that, you're going to leave the contemporary reader behind, because what use do they have for these sorts of claims about the numinous or the ambiguous or the unknowable, right? Sort of a baked-in agnosticism, if you want, to certain aesthetic approaches in literature, where I think that has changed radically. That wasn't always the case, for sure. I think there was a moment, right, that we went through where it was more the case. But now there's a lot more openness, and there are serious writers of faith who are in the mainstream establishment as well as sort of in the small press world, right, calling attention to these themes and doing their best to you know and not because of any sort of necessarily crusading right motivation, but just because it's so much a part of who they are, that it comes into the art as well. Or calling attention to the seriousness of what belief means, right, in human life.
So I was talking to a musician friend the other day, and he's older. He's in his 60s, and he was saying, back in the 90s, he's a jazz musician, and he was like, back in the 90s, I don't know what people are thinking now, but back in the 90s, the Catholics I met, so many of them were like suspicious of jazz, were like not open to it, and I was saying, I think that things have gotten better. It feels like things have improved in Catholic sort of openness to the arts. I mean, among like Orthodox Catholics, since I was in college, but I'm not sure if that's just because I moved to New York and met different kinds of Orthodox Catholics, or because I have been doing this podcast and have met more people on the national scene, so I have a better impression on it. But my impression has been that in the past decade or so, people have gotten more open, at least in theory, if not necessarily in sort of like a high level of personal taste, if that makes sense. But that in theory, there's a greater openness to the arts and to more contemporary arts than there used to be. Do you feel like that's the case?
I think that's true. I mean, from my pretty limited experience, but still, and to return, I guess, to the literary scene for a minute, not in 2005, the founding of Dappled Things was serious, definitely not the only thing happening to sort of shift gears or move the needle. In 2005, Marilyn Robinson's Gilead won I'm going to blank on which prize this was, but won a major, I think it might have been the Pulitzer. I would have to fact check that. But major prize winning novel focused on the experience of faith, right? And she's, a teacher at the University of Iowa, which of course is one of the major programs that, forms literary writers in this country. So, I think that was, key, right?
Mm-hmm.
To bringing people's attention in the first place to the thought that belief could again be taken seriously in American
Right.
literature, right? But yeah, I think too. Just there's sort of a narrative now that we're in a more post-secular moment, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. There's been, increasing secularization in American society, and there's a lot of talk about the nuns, NES, right? Believers who don't necessarily believe in anything or identify or affiliate with any organized religion. But, at the same time, there's an increased openness, if that makes sense. Precisely because people don't have, maybe necessarily one clear commitment, and there might be an opportunity there too in terms of there being more openness to considering what actually is real, right? What's the bedrock nature of reality, and what can we affirm is true, right?
But do you think that there's more openness on the part of Catholics to new art, to whether it's by Catholics or forms that may seem associated with the secular world, things that there might have been a little bit of suspicion or philistinism towards in 20 years ago or something like that.
Sure. I think that you're right. There definitely was, I think, 15 or 20 years ago, much more skepticism, much more assumed hostility between the church and the arts. Whether that was actually the case on the ground or not, there was sort of a perception, right, that these things didn't necessarily go together, at least in terms of the contemporary scene and in the
Right.
church. I think that that's shifting. I do. I'm not sure that the shift has necessarily, you know, sort of the pendulum's necessarily swung the
Right.
entire opposite way. And I do kind of find that, there still are folks who sort of, approach with trepidation or wonder what am I getting into, right,
Right.
when they pick up a contemporary novel. But I hope, I hope that things are happening
Yeah.
that sort of make it so that right we can find a better reconciliation between these things than maybe we have done so far.
Yeah, I feel like the openness is still often more in theory than in practice, like because we tend to be very intellectual in the Orthodox Catholic world in the United States, and so I think that there's been a lot more philosophical interest in art, more recently that has led people to be more open to, say watching a movie by Tarkovsky or things like that that might not have existed before as much. But it certainly hasn't swung all the way in terms of like a really thriving Catholic art scene, like a really really like as much as it could be. I mean, but it does seem as though the sort of the intellectual groundwork for that has been more or less laid. So it's just a matter of people actually doing it at this point.
I think that's well said. Yeah, there's still a ways to travel.
Yeah, yeah. It's also interesting that this is happening just when it's becoming increasingly impossible for Catholics to operate in the not in contemporary art mediums, but in the contemporary art scene, like socially and professionally. In other words, maybe it would have been nice if this had happened decades ago, so that we could have had more of a chance to actually influence things. But it seems providential that like there are more Catholics who actually have the level of craft and the level of training that they need to sort of start their own scene, as it were, like with this MFA program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, such that they don't need to depend as much upon a scene that increasingly has no use for them, not just because they're Catholic, but because they don't actively, affirm whatever secular doctrines they're supposed to affirm. So it's becoming increasingly like impossible to even just stay quiet and stay neutral, vocally speaking, in whether it's the film industry or literary world or whatever. So in a sense, it's good to see that there are people who have gotten their training and are able to get out, been able to plunder Egypt enough so that they can actually pass that knowledge down to other Catholics in a Catholic setting.
Sure, and to add on, I think, there are always going to be points of disagreement and of dissonance, but one thing that the Catholic tradition has a genius for is finding points of commonality and consonance and working from there. And I think to the extent that we can build maybe mutual understanding and fellowship, on those points, while not minimizing or dismissing disagreements, I think, right, there might be more hope for, continuing to sort of work alongside, right, and work sideways, even if possibly in the margins,
Yeah.
there's, I think reason to
Right.
hold out hope.
But it's also a good time to be independent, to be unfireable, uncancelable, and to have one's own institutions, and to, if you're going to collaborate with people of different viewpoints, to be able to do it from a position of independence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's well said. Well, I hope we'll all see you at the Catholic Imagination Conference in Dallas this
Yeah.
fall. We'll be there. We'll have, it seems like a pretty good contingent of, some of our editorial staff is planning to turn out. I'll be there. it's, as far as building the institutions and building the
Right.
infrastructure that Catholic writers and artists need, that's been a huge part of that. So, anyone's listening who has thought about it, I strongly encourage you to consider joining us. Looking forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great experience for me to go at the University of the Loyola University Chicago in 2019. I had some issues with some of the just how big the tent was at times. Some of the speakers, some of the featured speakers, were using their platform to attack church teaching, but my understanding is that the conference takes on a character based on whoever's hosting it. And so that was hosted by a Jesuit university. This one's hosted by University of Dallas. So I'm expecting a different character in that respect. And I certainly met a lot of great people, including you, Josh Wren, people like that. So I am looking forward to attending again, and James Majewski will be coming with me, it looks like. So I'm looking forward to...
I've had an advance, if I can say this, I don't know if I can say this, but I'm going to say it. I've had an advance peek at the schedule of speakers. It looks incredible.
Great.
I don't know if, I think the page has gone up, so I think it's okay to say, that I think, some wonderful writers are coming out, is some really exciting talks I'm looking forward to.
Great. Yeah. Well, Katy, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure talking to you. I'm so glad to have read this novel. I'm definitely going to be strongly recommending it to people in my personal life as well as on the podcast, which I don't always do with things that I recommend on the podcast. So congratulations on this great work.
That's such a gift. Thank you.
I hope to see more from you in the future for sure.
Thanks so much, Thomas.
All right, everybody, thank you for listening. If you've been watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. I will be linking to the Wise Blood Books website where you can purchase As Earth Without Water by Katy Carl. And I'll also link to the Dappled Things website so you can sample what they have online and perhaps subscribe. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Also, if you want to donate and help the show out, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio, and your donation will be earmarked for our podcast productions. We rely on listener support, so please do help us out if you, especially if you're a longtime listener and haven't been able to contribute yet.